When Ted, that vulture of a realtor, handed me the pen, his eyes gleamed with pure, undisguised greed. He thought he saw a frightened old man, someone who had lost the will to fight. I signed the papers, allowing him to dump every cent of his savings and every borrowed dollar into that house. I let him win because the only price I wanted him to pay was his complete financial catastrophe. It was the most expensive purchase of his miserable life, and I was going to make sure the receipt was delivered straight to his ruined reputation. My name is Edwin, and until 6 months ago I was just a quiet 65-year-old engineer trying to navigate life after my wife, Clara, passed away. This house, the one Ted was so eager to flip, wasn't just wood and plaster. It was my entire world. It was the home my father, a self-taught master builder, had constructed with his own 2 hands, riddled with his peculiar, brilliant engineering oddities. Every creaking floorboard, every slightly crooked window frame, it all held Clara's laughter and the memory of a life well lived. Ted saw a crumbling liability. I saw my identity. If you enjoy stories about greedy people getting exactly what they deserve through cunning and patience, and you want to follow this carefully planned revenge right up to the final explosion, hit that subscribe button now. You won't want to miss how this perfect plan unfolds. Ted, who married my daughter Sarah 10 years ago, is the kind of man who measures human value purely by net worth and commission percentage. He's a rising star in the local real estate game, and when Clara died, he didn't send flowers. He saw opportunity. The house, sitting on a huge, increasingly valuable lot just outside the city line, was his white whale. The minute Clara was gone, the pressure started. He'd come over, not to comfort Sarah, but to stalk the halls, pointing out every hairline crack and every peeling bit of wallpaper. "It's a money pit, Edwin," he'd drone, leaning against the kitchen counter like a predatory accountant. "It's structurally unsound. You're pouring your retirement into a sieve. Sell it to me now, cheap, before the market realizes how bad it is." He worked Sarah tirelessly. She, caught between grieving her mother and trusting her ambitious husband, was his perfect pawn. He'd whisper to her about security, about getting me a nice little condo where I wouldn't have to worry about maintenance. It was emotional manipulation disguised as filial concern. The worst part was his constant subtle aggression. He'd leave printouts of foreclosure notices or articles about house collapses open on my coffee table, all designed to make me feel weak and desperate. He wasn't asking me to sell. He was bullying me. He was trying to dismantle my life piece by piece, starting with the foundation, both literal and emotional. I watched him convince my daughter that my home was a hazard, that I was a liability, and that only his expertise could save us. The fury I felt was cold, not hot, and it settled deep in my bones, hardening into something sharp and meticulous. It was then, seeing the look of pity on Sarah's face that Ted had engineered, that I decided he wouldn't just win the deal, he'd lose everything he staked on it. Ted's ultimate mistake was believing that because I was grieving, I had stopped thinking like an engineer. He failed to realize that the one man who understood the structural eccentricities of this house was about to use them as a weapon. I had the ace up my sleeve, a secret left by my father years ago, and Ted, in his haste and arrogant confidence, never bothered to check the fine print, much less the inner workings of the house itself. He was so focused on the quick flip that he ignored the biggest, most expensive time bomb buried inside a seemingly innocuous wall. All I had to do was wait for the perfect moment to trigger the explosion. Ted walked out of the closing attorney's office looking like a glutton who'd just finished the feast. He barely spared me a nod, already dialing his contractor, talking about demo teams and maximizing square footage. He was so focused on the future high-rise condo complex he planned to squeeze onto the lot that he didn't even see the past standing right there, watching him. He didn't realize that the house he thought he'd bought for a steal held a secret, one put there by the only man who understood that true value sometimes lies in what is hidden. My father, bless his practical, slightly paranoid soul, was an engineer of life as much as he was a builder. He constructed this house piece by piece in the 1950s, using methods and materials that baffled modern inspectors. His favorite saying, often muttered over blueprints, was, "Edwin, never forget, the real security isn't in a safe, it's in the foundations and the load-bearing walls. That's where secrets belong." He built the house, but he also built the secret into it. For years I dismissed it as old man eccentricity until about 20 years ago while chasing a slow plumbing leak in the massive fireplace chimney stack in the living room. I was tracing a small vibration and accidentally dislodged a custom-cut stone block behind a panel access. It wasn't a crawl space, it was a perfect, dry, climate-controlled internal vault specifically designed into the building's central support system. Inside, there was no treasure chest, no gold bars, just a heavy sealed metal canister containing a few meticulously preserved documents. Most of it was boring, old engineering notes, but one particular document, brittle and yellowed, immediately snagged my attention. It was a formal, legally binding restrictive covenant, meticulously drafted and notarized back in 1954, long before the city's current zoning plan was finalized and digitally registered. This covenant, which my father had clearly arranged to have registered through some old obscure county clerkship, before the land was officially incorporated into the city's jurisdiction, explicitly stated that the lot was burdened by an easement of light and air for the benefit of a long-forgotten piece of adjacent land. More importantly, it contained a highly specific clause. It banned any new construction on the plot exceeding 2.5 stories in height. This was the quiet, devastating ace I held. Ted's entire financial model, the aggressive loans, the promises to investors, the quick flip strategy, was predicated on tearing down my humble 2-story house and erecting a massive, multi-story luxury development. He was sinking millions into a piece of land that, legally, could only ever host a slightly larger version of what was already there. When Ted performed his due diligence, he ran digital title checks. This covenant was so old, filed through such an antiquated and paper-based system, and tied to a property description that had since been renamed and parceled differently, that it hadn't shown up in any standard modern search. It was a ghost in the system, waiting for someone to summon it. I never told Clara, and certainly not Ted. That secret compartment wasn't for wealth, it was for leverage. My father knew that one day the land would become valuable, and greedy people might try to exploit the family. Ted was exactly the kind of vulture my father had foreseen. When I signed those closing papers in the attorney's office, I wasn't surrendering the house. I was merely handing Ted the deed to a cage. The house was now his legal and financial trap, and the restrictive covenant was the lock. I just needed him to walk far enough inside before I slammed the door shut, using his own greed as the perfect self-detonating fuse. The plan was simple. Let Ted invest heavily, let him commit, and then, at the point of no return, introduce the ghost document that would invalidate his entire investment strategy. The day I signed the closing papers was a masterpiece of feigned defeat. Ted had orchestrated the entire scene for maximum emotional impact, not on the lawyers, but on Sarah. He wanted her to witness the necessary sacrifice of her stubborn old father. He had pushed and pushed, using every emotional lever available, painting the house as a financial time bomb that was draining my future and, by extension, hers. I was supposed to look heartbroken, defeated, and grateful for his rescue, and I played the part perfectly. I sat at the mahogany table in the lawyer's office, the papers spread out like a surrender treaty. I made sure my hands trembled slightly as I reached for the pen. I took a deliberate pause, letting out a heavy sigh that was perfectly audible across the silent room. Ted couldn't hide his satisfaction. His mouth was set in that smug, thin line of a man who believes his superior intellect has just overcome a sentimental fool. He kept giving Sarah these quick, reassuring glances, signaling, "See? It's done. We won." It was. Sickening to watch his performance, but essential to mine. I was baiting the trap. The deeper he believed my defeat, the harder he would fall, as the pen scratched across the bottom line, finalizing the transfer of the property to Ted's Shell Corporation, the one he'd created specifically to isolate this high-risk, high-reward flip. I looked him dead in the eye. My gaze was intentionally hollow, a portrayal of a man who had nothing left to lose. "It's all yours now, Ted," I murmured, my voice cracking slightly. "I hope you find what you're looking for in these walls." That line was my little secret jab. He, of course, took it as sentimental rubbish, a grieving man's parting words. He didn't realize I was practically daring him to dig deeper into the structure, challenging him to find the very thing that would destroy him. I walked out of that office feeling lighter than air, despite the grim transaction. The money Ted had transferred was substantial, enough to secure my future comfortably, but to him it was merely an operating cost, a necessary evil to unlock the massive profit he envisioned. He wasn't buying a house, he was buying land zoned for a 12-story luxury tower. The moment I signed, the clock started ticking on his massive commercial loan, the one that required him to break ground on a multi-million-dollar structure within 6 months or face brutal penalties. He was now fully committed, financially and legally leveraged to the hilt. Later that evening, I watched Sarah comfort Ted, who was talking loudly on the phone, already barking orders to architects and engineers about the accelerated demolition schedule. It was a brutal scene to witness my daughter so completely under his influence, validating his ruthless behavior. This was the final stinging proof that my current plan, though agonizingly slow, was the only way to save her from his corrosive influence in the long run. I knew that the moment Ted's world collapsed, Sarah would finally see the true vulture hiding beneath the expensive suit. My heart ached for my daughter, but my engineer's mind was already 3 steps ahead, calculating the exact pressure needed to ensure the structural integrity of Ted's hubris failed completely. The stage was set, the papers were signed, and the secret in the wall was armed. Now the waiting game began, and every moment of Ted's triumphant spending was just more fuel for the fire. Ted wasted no time. The ink on the closing documents was barely dry before he began his campaign of erasure. 2 days after I reluctantly drove away from the driveway, a massive commercial dumpster, bright yellow and aggressively modern, was dropped right onto the front lawn, crushing my late mother's prize-winning rose bushes. It was a crude, offensive declaration of war. Ted wasn't just efficient, he was laced with spite. He didn't just want the land, he wanted to eradicate every trace of the life we had lived there, treating 50 years of memories like bulk trash. He had secured an incredibly risky, short-term commercial bridge loan. These types of loans come with brutal interest rates and tight deadlines. Tear down the existing structure and start vertical construction of the new high-rise within a very tight, unforgiving window. Ted, blinded by the projected $10 million profit he promised his silent partners, saw these deadlines not as liabilities, but as thrilling milestones. He hired the most aggressive, cheap, and fast demolition crew he could find, a team that moved with the subtlety of a wrecking ball and was notorious for cutting corners. Watching the beginning of the end was a calculated type of agony. Ted didn't even bother to inventory anything. He simply told his crew to gut the house, throwing away family heirlooms without a second glance. I stood across the street at the neighbor's curb, nursing a lukewarm coffee, observing the carnage. That's when the pain was sharpest, seeing the crew toss out the old hand-built cedar chest my father had gifted Clara and me on our wedding day. But beneath the grief, the engineer in me was calculating. Every load they hauled away was Ted's money burning. Every unnecessary expense, every rushed, sloppy decision was a tighter knot in the noose I had prepared for him. He was now financially leveraged to the point of structural failure. He had sunk a huge portion of his own savings into the purchase, securing the loan with every other asset he possessed. He needed the quick, high-margin flip to survive. The truly critical phase began when they started the interior demolition. Ted's architectural plans called for a full gut job, removing all internal non-load-bearing walls immediately to prepare for the real structural analysis, the analysis that would expose the restrictive covenant if anyone had bothered to look. But Ted was too confident in his digital title search. He was paying a crew overtime to smash the very walls that held his ruin. I watched them bring in the jackhammers and saw the first plumes of plaster dust billow from the windows. Ted even drove by, slowing down just long enough to give me a smug, triumphant wave from his imported SUV. He thought he was watching the end of my story. He was actually watching the start of his own countdown. The internal walls were coming down fast, and that meant the central chimney stack and the thickest part of the living room structure, the precise location of my father's hidden covenant, was next. The trap was sprung, and the prey was actively destroying the very ground beneath his own expensive, imported leather shoes. All I needed now was the signal that the document was exposed. The morning I moved my last few boxes was a hollow ritual. I had already given away everything Ted had deemed trash. All that remained were photographs, my father's old blueprints, and the heavy feeling of closing a life chapter. The demolition crew wasn't due until noon, giving me a final, crucial hour alone in the silent, half-gutted shell of my family home. This wasn't a time for sentimentality, it was time for engineering precision. I had to set the fuse. I went straight to the living room fireplace, specifically the central load-bearing column where the vault was hidden. My father built that wall with a subtle access panel disguised as a slightly oversized decorative stone block, the one I had discovered years ago. A professional structural engineer doing a proper inspection would have noticed the minute difference in mortar and the expertly cut seam. Ted's cheap rush demo crew wouldn't. They would just attack the wall with brute force. My job was to ensure that the brute force hit the exact right spot. I pulled out a small, specialized metal pick from my old toolbox, the kind used for fine masonry adjustments. I wasn't damaging the wall, I was merely adjusting the stress vectors. The key block was held in place not just by its fit, but by a precise application of pressure from the surrounding blocks. I carefully, patiently, removed a microscopic sliver of old mortar from the top and left sides of the hidden stone block. This wasn't visible to the naked eye, it wouldn't cause the block to fall out, but it critically weakened its support against lateral impact. More importantly, I installed a specific, almost invisible marker. Behind a small piece of loose trim that Ted's crew had already ignored, I inserted a tiny, specially shaped piece of aluminum foil. This piece of foil, combined with the slightly loosened block, created a distinct, minute resonance. My final act was a test. I tapped the wall lightly with my knuckle, just below the block. The resulting sound was now fractionally but distinctly different, a hollow, almost buzzing vibration that a careless, aggressive jackhammer operator wouldn't notice, but which guaranteed that the block would vibrate itself loose or even completely dislodge the instant the heavy-duty machinery started attacking the adjacent material. I knew Ted's plan was to demolish the internal walls first, to clear space for the new foundations. He was so focused on the profit, he would rush the demo. His crew would be loud, fast, and sloppy. The moment that demolition started, my father's safeguard would become volatile. I closed my toolbox, took a final look at the scarred, dusty room, and smiled grimly. The house was now an expensive legal bomb, and the crew Ted was paying overtime was about to detonate it. I had done my part. The rest was up to the laws of physics, shoddy labor, and Ted's relentless, blinding greed. Stepping outside and locking the door for the final time felt less like an exile and more like sealing a vault containing a perfect, inevitable disaster. The moment I left the old house for good, I entered a surreal form of purgatory. I had secured a small, quiet apartment miles away from Ted and Sarah, near the city archives and my old engineering club, places where I could think clearly. The check Ted gave me sat untouched in a high-interest account, the collateral for his eventual collapse. Every day that passed was another bead of sweat on Ted's brow, another $1,000 in interest accruing on his oversized loan, and more importantly, another day closer to the demolition crew hitting the right wall. The waiting was the hardest part of the revenge. It felt like holding my breath underwater. I knew the trap was set, but I had no direct control over the trigger. I was relying entirely on the sloppiness of a hired crew and the blinding speed of Ted's ambition. To manage the anxiety, I didn't watch the house. Instead, I meticulously studied the original legal documents I had found in the wall. I spent hours at the city planning department pretending to be a retired history buff, cross-referencing my father's ancient restrictive covenant with modern zoning laws. I learned precisely how to weaponize the document. It wasn't enough just to have the document. I needed to know which specific department had the most immediate and decisive authority to halt a high-rise construction project based on a newly surfaced, legally binding easement. It wasn't the zoning board who would drag their feet. It was the Department of Public Works and Infrastructure, the one responsible for certifying utility access and street access permits. My father's document didn't just restrict height, it contained an obscure clause about a shared storm drain easement with the neighboring property that mandated perpetual ground access, effectively making the high-rise foundation impossible without renegotiating the entire city infrastructure plan. I rehearsed the phone call in my mind dozens of times. My plan wasn't to scream or threaten a lawsuit. That would give Ted time to react. My plan was to act like a helpful, civic-minded citizen, simply alerting a mid-level bureaucrat to a potential future liability. I would provide the exact book, page, and line number of the old record, making it impossible for them to ignore. An anonymous tip that forced the city to conduct a mandatory stop work order pending a full infrastructure review. This bureaucratic roadblock would be Ted's true undoing. The silence from Sarah was also deafening. She was too busy basking in the reflected glow of Ted's big deal and the promise of their new opulent lifestyle. That distance was painful, yet necessary. It fortified my resolve. This wasn't just about money. It was about tearing down the financial pedestal Ted had built for himself, a pedestal that was crushing my daughter's judgment. He was betting everything on speed and secrecy. I was betting on jurisprudence and the immutable slow grind of city bureaucracy. I just needed one tiny, accidental vibration from a jackhammer to start the earthquake. And then I would make my call. 3 weeks. 21 agonizing days passed, where the only news I received about the house was the dull roar of machinery echoing through the neighborhood whenever I dared to check the local community forum. Ted was operating at a frantic pace, desperate to beat the clock on his bridge loan and start securing pre-sales for the high-rise units. I knew they were past the superficial walls and were now attacking the core structure. My engineered fuse was under constant stress. The call came late on a Tuesday afternoon. It wasn't Sarah. It wasn't Ted. It was a number I didn't recognize, registered to a construction company based 3 towns over, the cheap crew Ted had hired. I almost missed the call, my finger hovering over the ignore button. The voice on the other end was rough, frustrated, and thick with a local accent. "Yeah, is this Ed, the old owner of the place on Pine Street?" My heart hammered against my ribs, a dull, heavy drumbeat. This was it. "This is Edwin. Yes. What is it?" I kept my voice flat, almost bored. The contractor, a man named Mike, the foreman of the demolition crew, sounded genuinely annoyed. "Look, your son-in-law is a lunatic. We're tearing out this central chimney area, right? The wall is thick as a bank vault. We just had a piece of the interior masonry pop out, not from the hammer, just popped clean out, and there's a tin box inside. Looks like old records or something. Seriously, what is it with old guys hiding junk in walls? Ted didn't say nothing about this. I had to clench my jaw to keep the euphoria out of my voice. The tiny aluminum shim, the subtly repositioned mortar, they had worked perfectly. The constant, heavy vibration of the jackhammers against the adjacent blocks had forced the hidden stone to yield. Oh, that's just some old sentimental nonsense my dad the builder used to do, just some receipts or something. Throw it in the dumpster, Mike. I signed everything over. It's Ted's problem now. We can't just toss it, man, Mike insisted, sounding confused by my indifference. It's like sealed. Looks official. You sure you don't want it back? I gave him the final crucial instruction, the one that sealed Ted's fate. Listen, Mike, I don't want anything that Ted owns. Just drop it on the ground and take a picture of it for your records so Ted can't blame you for destroying it later. Then forget it. I gave him a non-committal grunt and hung up, my hands trembling. I knew Mike, nervous about liability and following my strange, dismissive advice, would do exactly that. Document the strange, official-looking box of papers and then leave it for Ted to discover later. The document was now undeniably newly discovered on the property and discovered by Ted's own hired workers. The timing was now perfect. Ted was deep into the demolition, hemorrhaging money on hourly labor and loan interest. He was too deep to pull back without massive loss, and he was completely unaware of the bomb his own team had just unearthed. I opened my laptop and pulled up the contact list for the Department of Public Works and Infrastructure. The moment for the helpful, civic-minded citizen call had arrived. I was ready to pull the main lever on Ted's carefully constructed empire. The next morning, the adrenaline was gone, replaced by a cold, surgical calm. I put on my best shirt, made a strong cup of coffee, and sat down at the small table in my rented room. This was the moment for the activation. I wasn't calling the police, I wasn't calling a lawyer, and I certainly wasn't calling Ted. I was calling the bureaucracy. I dialed the number for the Department of Public Works and Infrastructure. It took 3 transfers, a hold time that would test the patience of a saint, and a friendly but dull conversation with a man named Gary. "Hi, Gary. I hope you can help me out," I said, making my voice sound like that of a concerned yet slightly confused elderly gentleman. "I'm Edwin Miller. I used to own the property at 42 Maple Street, but it was just recently sold. I was just thinking about that old main drain connection, the one that runs under what used to be the utility room wall," Gary hummed noncommittally. "Yes, sir. All city maps show that main line." "Right. Now, my late father, he built that house back in the 60s, and he was a meticulous builder. He always kept the original plans. We just moved out, and I happened to find the original survey appendix in a box. It shows a grandfathered easement, a permanent right of access for city crews, specifically detailing the required setback zone, and a limit on structural load directly above that line. It was an amendment filed back in '68, the paperwork for which I believe was never properly recorded in the modern digital county records, but it's all stamped and official. I was performing an information drop, a piece of carefully calibrated intelligence. I didn't accuse Ted of anything. I simply provided the city with a crucial piece of data that their own digital system had missed. The new owner, Mr. Theodore Vance, he's planning a huge high-rise development there, and I saw they've already dug up quite a bit. I just wanted to make sure they're aware of that specific easement. It would be terrible if they compromised a main sewer line, wouldn't it? Could potentially cause problems for the whole neighborhood. I just wanted to be a good citizen and make sure your team has those documents." Gary's tone immediately shifted from bored to alert. Compromising a main sewer line is a headache the city does not want. That small, old amendment document, which I knew my father had filed to protect the site from future commercialization, was now my silver bullet. It didn't just restrict high-rise development, it mandated a setback zone around the line that would make Ted's entire proposed footprint financially non-viable. I politely promised to email a photo of the document's cover sheet and hung up. The domino had fallen. I didn't need to fight Ted in court. I just needed to alert the city's bureaucracy, which would happily fight him for me, using his own expensive mistakes as ammunition. All I had to do now was wait for the inevitable stop work order. The silence from the Department of Public Works was the most deafening sound I'd ever heard. For 3 days, nothing. Then, on the 4th morning, I got a call from Sarah, my daughter. Her voice was thin, reedy, not angry, just shattered. "Dad, what did you do?" "The city just slapped a stop work order on the lot. They literally just chained the gates shut and put up notices. They're saying there's a massive issue with the underground utility easements, something about grandfathered rights of way for the main sewer line that was registered back in the 1960s. They said they found an old amendment document, a survey appendix, that was never properly digitized by the county, only referenced in the deep archives." I played the role of the confused but helpful father. "Oh, sweetie, I'm so sorry. I wouldn't know. Maybe it's something my dad did. He was always tweaking things. Did you talk to Ted?" Sarah's next sentence was delivered through gritted teeth. "Ted is losing his mind. He was just served with a summons. It's a civil suit from the city planning department, not a fine, a suit, arguing that the land's use restriction detailed in that old appendix makes his proposed high-rise development impossible. The entire development plan is invalidated. He's already sunk $500,000 into the purchase, plus the demolition costs, and the interest on that high-risk bridge loan is going to bleed him dry in weeks. Ted's entire financial structure was built on speed and flipping a clean asset. The moment the city declared the land unclean and restricted its use, the bank froze the commercial loan. No one would lend money on property that could be tied up in litigation for years and had severely restricted usage. The value of the land, which he bought for a premium as a developable lot, instantly plummeted to practically nothing, the value of a small residential lot, if that. He was now leveraged to the hilt, paying interest on a frozen loan for a worthless asset. The final, exquisite moment of the culmination happened 2 days later. Ted, smelling of desperation and failure, stormed into my rented apartment. He didn't shout. He looked like a statue carved out of granite, cracking slowly. "You knew," he whispered, his voice dangerously low. "You engineered this. The slow shutter speed on the camera, the little crack in the plaster, you knew exactly where that document was. You let me sign, you watched me borrow, you watched me destroy my own life savings, and you said nothing." I finally dropped the act. I looked him straight in his venomous eyes. "Ted, you didn't just pressure me to sell a house. You tried to erase 30 years of my life and the memory of my wife for a profit margin. You saw a vulnerable old man, and you tried to eat him alive. I didn't defraud you. I signed the documents you put in front of me. I didn't lie. I simply didn't disclose information you were too lazy and too arrogant to find yourself. You failed at the most basic due diligence of a realtor, Ted. You paid the price for your own greed. I hope you enjoy the view from the bottom." He stood there for a moment, processing the totality of his ruin. Then he turned and walked out, his developer empire collapsing into dust behind him. The silent, legal, and absolute nature of the revenge was perfect. The aftermath was swift and total. Ted, facing mountains of debt and a frozen, worthless asset, had to liquidate everything. His flashy car, his expensive condo, all gone. It was the price of arrogance. Sarah, my daughter, witnessed the entire collapse. When Ted tried to blame me for a dirty trick, she finally saw the manipulative, greedy man she had married. She packed her bags and came to stay with me in my temporary place, heartbroken but clear-headed. "He never saw the house as home, Dad. He just saw dollar signs. I'm so sorry I didn't listen to you sooner," she confessed one evening. That apology, genuine and from the heart, was worth more than any revenge. The legal process dragged on for months, but eventually the land title was cleansed of Ted's claim, though the usage restrictions remained, ensuring no one could ever build a monstrous high-rise on my father's legacy. The land came back to the family, managed by Sarah and me. We decided to sell the stripped-down shell to a young couple who wanted to restore it to its original residential charm. We used the profit to buy a smaller, cozier place nearby, one without walls hiding secrets, but surrounded by new, happier memories. My life didn't end with the house, it started over. I took the engineering expertise I used to destroy Ted's empire and applied it to building my own future. I started volunteering at a local community college, teaching young students the value of meticulous detail and the dangers of cutting corners, life lessons learned the hard way. I traveled with Sarah, strengthening our bond, focusing on the simple, genuine things that truly matter. I was no longer the grieving widower or the passive old man. I was Edwin, the engineer who waited patiently for justice and built his way back to happiness. The greedy vulture thought he bought a house for nothing, but he ended up paying everything. And I got my peace back. So, what do you think? Did I do the right thing? Would you have waited, knowing the emotional cost of letting him tear down your memories? Or would you have stopped him sooner? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this true story of revenge and redemption, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next fascinating story of justice served. Thank you for listening.